Welcome to the Soy Maravillosa Afro Latinx experience, the podcast that celebrates the experiences and stories of Afro Latinos. For Hispanic Heritage Month, we are celebrating Afro Latinos who were born and raised in the El Paso, Texas borderland. I am your host, Dr. Jackeline Richard. And today we have the pleasure of speaking with a remarkable woman who was born and raised in this vibrant community. Let's dive into her unique journey as an Afro Latina in the borderland. Welcome, Nancy Green.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. Thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast. You're initiating a very important movement, ¿verdad? Within other movements that are getting a lot of energy. And your leadership along the border is very clear, ¿verdad? And the fact that you are reaching out to Afro Latinas to gather, organize, share, support each other is a blessing. Thank you.
I appreciate you being here. And today's topic is going to be the Afro Latino experience in El Paso, Texas borderlands, resiliency and arts. And to begin with, now, I want to go into the concept of this whole concept of Afro Latino, Afro Latinidad. Can you explain to our listeners what it means to you to identify as an Afro Latina? Because the experience, as we all know, to identify as Afro Latina is really an experience that's individual. It's a choice that we make. And so I really am interested in the stories behind it and how people define Afro Latinidad for themselves. So explain how you do it to our listeners.
After a long journey, ¿verdad? I'm getting ready to be 72 years old to reach
Oh.
that magical age for me. I found balance in acknowledging both heritages. My mother Mexican, my father African American, and it was important for me to find my center, to find the balance, and Afro Latinidad is that journey, in my opinion, where we get to define ourselves. I personally define myself in many of my bios as Afro Chicana because I do acknowledge that from my Mexican heritage, the Chicano movement as a political movement that has brought about social justice and has struggled not just for social justice, but for human rights, ¿verdad? Resonates from my heart, ¿verdad? And the same thing with the African American experience in the United States and globally. So the diaspora has been growing. And as we, as Afro descendants, ¿verdad? También that's another aspect of the identity question. Um, we are the majority in this planet, ¿verdad? And unless we basically achieve that understanding and claim that as our sacred right, we can be diminished, we can be erased, we can be made to feel invisible,
Mhm.
when in fact, we are the majority of the human beings, and the origin of humanity as we know it now comes from Africa.
Just to delve in a little bit more about your background, I want to know more about your identity and how it shaped your experiences growing up in the borderland area. And actually, you had the experience of also growing up in Juarez. And so I want to know, start off with your mom and your dad and the racial climate that was at the time when you were born.
In 1952, it was against the law for a Mexican woman to marry an African American man, and also a Native American man, and also an Asian man. Now, who came up with this locura, right? Este, explain some of what is going on now, for people who want to go back to whatever madness was happening at the time. But it was a felony for my mother and my father to marry. Now, he was in the military. He was a master sergeant in the army. And he and my mother could not marry in Texas. They had to go to New Mexico to marry. And so I was born of a felony.
Wow.
And I laugh because it is so ridiculous. White supremacy, which was behind all these so-called laws and these movements, even in modern times, is a fallacy. It is a social construct. Someone invented, some miseducated so-called scientists decided to categorize human beings using uh, very little scientific methods. And Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is a psychologist from the Bay Area, African American woman, really breaks it down. She talks about who was doing the categorizing, who was determining policy, and for what reasons. Growing up in the Juarez, El Paso region, ¿verdad? Was a challenge for me as a child. When did I realize I'm different from my sisters and my brother? My mother had other children when she married my father, and they were born in Mexico. They were Mexican, from Mexican fathers. And so este I don't know when it happened, but as children, we reach a stage in our development where we're able to identify us, ourselves. And so that's who's in the mirror. And I can compare to my sister, or there's, the little cat that's walking around. That's the cat. That's my sister. And so this is me. And I can look at my skin. I can feel my hair. I don't know what age that happened for me, but it does for all of us when we actually begin to define our own identity physically. Now, for the children who cannot see, it's a different process, ¿verdad? But if we can feel, and usually race, of course, is associated with the color of our skin. And the thing is that because it is a social construct, it is used to control our movement within different systems, from the healthcare system, to government and politics, and the educational system.
Well,
And it is
tell me this. How did it, for you as a child, how did being defined by this social construct that's race, right? That is, we know it's a social construct now. And it's something that people don't realize, that when the reason why the Afro Latino talk is important is because in Afro Latinos to really be vocal and seen is because we're really talking about something that has nothing to do with race. Being Afro Latino, it has nothing to do with race. It has to do more with customs, traditions, with this diaspora, but it's not a color thing per se. It's not a race thing as we define. And so I'm interested to know about, as a child in school, you went to school in Juarez, right? You lived
Yes.
there. How was that experience? Were there other little children who were of African descent? I imagine there were other children who were probably not white, but others children maybe who were of African descent. What was that experience like, being in school, being in your neighborhood? How was that? What was that like?
Other children did not define themselves, as using color, because there were a lot of indigenous children who had beautiful dark skin, ¿verdad? Just as we find among Afro Latinos all over the world. And so, for me now, as an older adult, the color of my skin has become a source of pride, and it was a source of pride growing up. The other children had the Mexican children of all colors. este had different reactions to me as a uh, black girl who spoke Spanish. I still, sometimes people's jaws drop to the ground when they hear me speaking Spanish. Si empiezo a hablar español, hasta se le cae la quijada al piso.
Así
Entonces
es.
yo como que,
Yo
ay, oh,
conozco esa
sí, ¿verdad?
reacción.
Oh, you speak Spanish, hablas español. El otro día entrando a un evento en un museo, eso fue lo que me dijo una de las jóvenes. ¿Habla español? Le digo, sí, y tú también, ¿verdad? Just kind of flipping it a little bit. Tú también, ¿verdad? It's like, okay, think about that. ¿Qué te estoy diciendo?
Oh,
Porque eres, tu semblante, tu color de piel, la textura de tu pelo es como es. Debo de asumir que tú no debieras de hablar español. Pero eso es lo que me hacían de niña, ¿verdad? Se asumía que yo no debiera de hablar español. Y eso es parte de la ignorancia que se da, ¿verdad? Simplemente por no saber. He tenido clientas que me dicen cuando voy a sus casas a dar clases de música a sus niños con discapacidades, lo que me dicen algunas clientas, yo nunca había interactuado con una mujer negra. I had never interacted
wow.
with anyone black. So I didn't know. And so they began to explore their own upbringing and their own beliefs. Pero I was doing that all along, just like we all do, and trying to understand why, in many cases, why the aggression, why the bullying, why the rejection, why the disrespect. And a lot of it had to do with whatever norms and values they were learning in their own homes. The educational system had a lot to do with it.
Well, tell me this, how, because this sounds like you've experienced racism and some degree of discrimination in that, in growing up both in Juarez and here. Tell me about what strategies or support system help you build the resilience, because you're here, you're 70 something, and so you've made it, right? And you've done really great things. And I want to talk about some of that. But I want to just focus on what is it that give you that kind of resilience to be able to get through it. Tell me about how your mother, because when I hear a lot, especially here in El Paso, about children who are Afro Latinos, and oftentimes the mom is Mexican and the father is African American, and some of them don't seem to really have a good grasp as to how to protect your child in that situation. Tell me about your mother. How did she play a role in your upbringing and in you being able to develop resiliency?
My mother was a fighter, continues to be in the spiritual realm. My grandmother was a fighter. They, my grandmother, my mother, and my tias were cooks, and they worked in the different mining towns. Um, it just so happens that my father, African American from War, West Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
¿verdad? Which is a mining town, ¿verdad? Tiny place, 690 inhabitants in 2020. So he was coming from a tiny mining town, joined the military, traveled, the world, was sent to Korea. He and my mother met. And by that time, my mother already was a fighter. She was also a curandera. So she understood that in the spiritual realm, there is no color. There are no color lines, although there are in terms of frequencies and the colors associated with frequencies. ¿Verdad? Pero she, as a Mexican woman, also understood that she was Afro descendant. And my oldest sister would talk openly about the fact that they had lived, my mother and my grandmother had lived in Torreon, Coahuila, and would travel to the different mining towns. That region in Mexico has been the home for even some of the runaway enslaved people, ¿verdad? Pero more traditionally, when we look at Mexico and the different regions and where the enslaved people that were brought directly from Africa settled, ¿verdad? Yes, everyone mentions Veracruz because it was one of the largest
Mhm.
ports, but my family had also lived, my mother and my tias and my grandma in Veracruz, and they had traveled to Baja California. So they migrated back and forth. And just like many other Afro descendants in Mexico, uh, who have not been recognized officially, if we look at the policies of Vicente Guerrero, who was himself an Afro descendant, ¿verdad? The idea was, let's not go there. Let's not focus on color. Let's look at who we are as human beings and what traditions, what different cultures we have been a product of in some ways. So for me as a child, it was important to understand that what my mother was saying, don't lower your head if you're feeling bad about what someone, an adult, said to you, called you the N word, in using the Mexican term, ¿verdad? Don't ever lower your head. So be proud of who you are. That was her message. And she would fight on my behalf if she had to, physically fight to
So your
protect.
mother really protected you. Your mother really gave you a support system that that saw you as a person with value, not as just someone in the family who happened to be darker than everybody else or whose hair was different than everybody else. You were her child and she was your protector.
Yeah. And my only brother, born in Mexico, and his father was Mexican. He was, our skin color was very similar, just like many, many other
Yes.
Mexican people, and especially a lot of indigenous people, the people that are crossing now. Woo,
Yes, you see that. And one of the things that you brought up, and I just wanted to touch on that, is that a lot of Latin American countries actually did that whole thing where they didn't, for example, they didn't count people based on race, and which at the end of the day still ended up hurting people who were indigenous, hurting people who were associated with being Afro descendants. And because they weren't seen, they weren't counted, right? So everybody, but the only people who were really being seen were the people who were white. And those were the people who were most of the time in leadership positions with the country and stuff like that. And it happened in Puerto Rico, and I know that happened quite frequently in many of the Latin American countries. And some countries they just didn't even count. They just disregarded the fact that they had people who were of African descent in some countries. And I know in Mexico, around, I think it was 2015, they started to allow people to actually, on the census, identify as being of African descendants. And so it's a huge move, but there's still a lot of work to be done. But just that's something that comes up because it's an interesting way of looking at race or not looking at it, but you still get racism, you still get classism, you still have colorism working, right? I know you're a teacher, you're a musician, you're a poet. So how do you incorporate your lived experiences as an Afro Latina in that realm, in your music, in your poetry, and in your teaching?
For me, my life has been a life of resistance against suppression, repression, and just downright annihilation. And to understand that there were generation upon generation of families who lived through that hell, that's not something I can forget. And the more I studied, the more I learned, the more I listened to the people around me, a lot of the elders in the fields who were talking openly about how unfair it was to work a 12-hour day and get paid for $5. and how these attitudes of superiority are tied to economic strategies to maintain a free labor force and use color as a defining este, uh, marker to control literally the masses. You know, as my mother used to say, cállate, no, no hables tanto. But, you know, as an adolescent, I was already, I was growing up by that time, not in Juarez, but in Segundo Barrio here in El Paso. And one of the things I would say to my mom is, Ama, that's part of the problem. Nobody listens. We are here living under these conditions. And I'm basically calling them out, them, the government itself, the owners of the buildings. Some of the buildings where my mother and I lived, because we had to cross over to the US side, and my sisters who were Mexican had to stay in Juarez until they could get their passports. So our family was divided. But when we moved into El Paso, the living conditions were worse than when we lived in Juarez.
Oh,
And
wow.
that's something that I began to analyze also. And also not just the living conditions, but the attitudes in the schools were a little bit different. You don't know any English? Well, you must be dumb. And those were the teachers. And the other kids were, they knew a little bit of English, and it was like, I'm better than you because I can say popcorn, better than you. And now we face that in the workplace. We face it in educational institutions. You have to follow the norms. You have to use the language that is dictated.
So tell me this, how does that resistance, does that, all of that lived experience, seeing all of that, how does that play into your music? How does that play into your poetry? What do you do with all of that?
Hmm. Well, I learned to drum, ¿verdad? I learned the rhythms when I lived in Massachusetts. I lived in the Boston area for 23 winters when I left El Paso to go to school over there. And it's
23 winters. I just got that.
kind of
Yeah,
cold.
you can't forget the winters up there.
este, and I mean the Caribbean culture is so rich and invigorating, and I found myself accepted, very different from my experience in Juarez. In Juarez, I was an oddity, or a little negrita. In the Northeast, living among Puerto Rican people, Dominican, verdad, uh, and then also connecting with African people. The Boston area is very international in nature. It's like a college town. There are a lot of working people, and I could relate at every level. I never forgot who I am and where I was coming from. And that's what not only keeps me alive, but it helps me to connect with other human beings who are living in an incredible experience this time around. So that always helped, and it was always up front and center. Respect, the importance of respecting other people, the importance of respecting other cultures, learning from them, appreciating. Man, the first time I had pasteles, it was like, oh my God, this is different from tamales, but they are so good. And just sharing that the joy of interacting with other person. Of course, that influenced my music. The rhythms that I was learning. There was this brother who is a drummer, and his advice was never play the drum with anger. He said, make sure that you are able to, if you are angry, put your anger aside and then play the drum and enjoy the beauty of the drumming. And that changed my life because it helped me to put the anger aside. Of course, I was very angry about what was going on, and being a young adult at the time that I arrived in the Boston area. Um, all kind. I mean, growing up in Juarez and in Segundo Barrio, it was in the middle of the civil rights movement, and we could not help but even watching television, watching the children being attacked by the rabid dogs, hearing about the little girls that were bombed in their church. That was part of my growing up and having to understand what does that mean and why is it happening, so questioning always. And then when I got to the Boston area, there were Black children being attacked for trying to integrate a school. And these were busloads of children. It wasn't just one or two or three or four, like the pioneers that were being attacked, during the civil rights movement. But this was back in 71, and there were busloads of children being attacked by parents. And it was based on race, and it wasn't even about white parents with privilege. It was white people, working people who didn't have much, being terrified that now the Black people were coming in and they were going to take what little they had. That's the thinking. That's the backward retrograda thinking that
So,
still prevails.
so you had that perfect recipe already going on around you that you can then take and put it back out into the world through
Yeah.
art and through poetry in a way that's beautiful, and that's that creative way. I often identify with that kind of activism that was going on, and it just seems from what you're telling me that you're right there in the middle of it. You saw some of it on TV here in when you were growing up, but when you went there to Boston, you just got a chance to experience a broader aspect of everything that was going on. And one of the things I admire about you is the way in which you unapologetically wear your Afro Latinidad. And I've gleaned from what you said some of the ways in which you really develop that strength to do it. So tell me this, let's talk about the future. What are your hopes for the future of Afro Latinos right here in the borderland or in general?
I think that the sense of pride that we have been developing can continue to grow so that we can achieve our dreams and our goals and be one with ourselves, within ourselves, it, and at the same time acknowledge and recognize and respect all cultures.
That
As human beings, we have to be able to transcend this dimension, and at the spiritual level acknowledge the beauty and the talent and the positive energy of other human beings. We're all at different stages of our lives, and we struggle in different ways. Let's continue to look at let's continue to raise our voices to stop hatred, stop injustice, stop the abuse against all human beings, stop the useless wars, that are being contrived for a small portion of individuals to make a profit. It's like, come on, folks, let's, as a clear group, ¿verdad? That honors our Afro Latinidad, our Afro descendancy, to continue to thrive and grow and contribute to the development of of humanity. And these are very broad terms. That's how I have to think in order to stay focused, because it's the pettiness and the ways that we are being triggered, systematically triggered to respond in violent ways, that works against us. It's to
well,
our detriment.
tell me this, what would you tell? I think nowadays, I know in many other circles that I belong to, we're always concerned about the youth not being engaged, the youth It's not their interests are not the same as our interests were at their age. So what would you, and I know here in El Paso in the borderland there are plenty of youth who are Afro Latinos in terms of just parentage and that kind of thing. What advice would you give to a young Afro Latino in terms of this intersection with their African descendants and Latinidad? What advice would you give them?
To love themselves deeply, to love their family members despite their faults, to achieve dreams that they can imagine and that they can work on making a reality. Be you at your best every moment. And when you're not feeling well, when you're feeling down, understand that there is a purpose and that there is a higher power that helps us all to sustain our suffering. But work past it, dream past it, study all that you can, learn as much as you can about everything, and especially yourself. Honor your parents, your family, respect everyone. Suspend judgment is something that we were talking about the
Mhm.
other day. Suspending judgment. How do we do that? Learn how to do that so that when you meet someone new, you don't make assumptions about that person. You don't immediately attack who they are as a person based on their color, based on the way they speak or may not be able to speak. Todo eso, I mean, it's about
Yeah.
be you and do you to the best of your ability and be proud of who you are.
As we end today's episode, I'm really a fan of your poems and your poetry. So I would love to end this very first episode with you reading one of your poems. So how about that?
Okay, that'll work.
Okay. And what is the name of the poem?
This is called Spiritual Pride. And before we started the podcast, I was able to translate it into Spanish. That's another thing with Afro Latinos. Learn as many languages as you can so that you can communicate with many more people and you can bring your message of hope, verdad, and of love.
So in Spanish and in English. So say them both. Okay.
Ándele pues. Primero
All right.
empiezo en inglés. I'll start in
Muy bien.
English.
Okay.
Spiritual pride. The color of my skin, a source of pride. The texture of my hair, a sacred mantle of love. My ancestral lineage, a guided journey of discovery. The dark beauty of my eyes reflects the depth of my vision. I am of this earth, yet travel through the cosmos in spirals of eternal memory. En español, orgullo espiritual. El color de mi piel, el origen de mi orgullo. La textura de mi pelo, un manto sagrado de amor. Un viaje por el cual mis guías me llevan al descubrimiento. La belleza de mis ojos oscuros reflejan la profundidad de mi visión. Soy de esta tierra, pero viajo por el cosmos en espirales de memoria eterna. H.
Beautiful.
Gracias.
Thank you
Gracias.
so much. Thank you, Nancy, for sharing your inspiring journey as an Afro Latina in the borderland. Your story is truly it's empowering, and actually I just thank you so much for being my first Soy Maravillosa Afro Latinx experience guest. And I'm sure that this is the first of many other times that I'll ask you to come back. But that actually concludes our episode today of Soy Maravillosa Afro Latinx Experience. We hope you found some inspiration and insights in our discussion. Remember, your voice matters, and together we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue our celebration of the Afro Latinx experience in the Borderland. Until then, stay maravillosa.